Truth Revolution.
Thank you for joining us on Truth Revolution. This is where faith and reason meet. This is Pastor Dave. That's Pastor Jeff.
You all right there?
Yeah, sorry, blank for a second. Anyway, this is Truth Revolution. Faith and reason meet right here, and we really like to kind of make them mush together. People like to separate faith and reason, but we want to have a mashup right here, right?
That's right. We believe in the truth, in reason. We believe that things like science matters. We believe things like archaeology matter. We believe, though, also that faith matters.
Absolutely.
We can believe in the Bible. We believe in Jesus. But we don't believe this is a contradiction. They actually go together. And actually, today, we have a very special guest who's going to talk a little bit about how that works.
Right. Today, we welcome Dr. J.P. Moreland. He's a distinguished professor of philosophy at Talbot School of Theology, Biola University in La Miranda, California.
La Mirada, dude.
Okay. Well, all right. There you go. Anyway, he has earned 4 degrees, a BS in chemistry from the University of Missouri, a THM in theology from Dallas Theological Seminary, an MA in philosophy from the University of California, Riverside, and a PhD in philosophy from the University of Southern California. He has co-planted 3 churches, spoken and debated on over 175 college campuses, and authored or co-authored 30 books. Sounds like a really, really busy life.
Welcome to the show, Dr. Morey. I'm glad you could be with us.
Well, it's a joy to be here, and I'm really glad to have this chance.
Awesome. And, we had you back on the show in 2015. It's been way too long. Glad to have you on again. I saw that you wrote a book, Scientism and Secularism. I read the description about it and thought, oh, man, that is exactly what we love to talk about here. Why don't you give us the quick lowdown? What is the book all about?
Well, that's a good question. The book is called Science and Secularism, Learning to Defeat a Dangerous Ideology. And the book is primarily about this. While science is a wonderful thing, scientism is a philosophy that is horribly destructive. It is basically the idea that the only way we can know reality, or certainly a vastly superior way to know reality, is through the hard sciences. If you can prove it and test it in physics and chemistry and the hard sciences, you can know it. If you can't test it in physics or chemistry or hard science, then it's nothing but a matter of personal opinion and emotion, and no one can know anything in theology, philosophy, ethics, and other branches of study.
Oh, that is great. Okay, so I meet people like this all the time. They say things like, well, I believe in science, but I don't believe in faith. And so what you're positing in the book is this is not just an individual person here and there. This is kind of a wild scale philosophy that people hold.
Well, this is the major worldview in Western culture, and it has been for at least 2 centuries. And it has secularized Europe, and it's starting to secularize the United States. And remember, it's the idea that the only way we have of really knowing what's real is through the methods of physics and chemistry and the hard sciences. I had a gentleman come up to me at a gathering where I was going to give a talk. He had a PhD in physics from Johns Hopkins and was an engineer, and
Smart
he
guy.
heard that I was a philosopher. And before the meeting, he comes up and says, "Say, I understand that you're a philosopher and a theologian." And I said, "Well, I give it my best shot." And he said, "Yeah, I used to be interested in philosophy when I was a teenager. But that was before I matured and grew up as an adult intellectually. And now that I think as an adult, I've come to realize that the only way you can know anything is if you can quantify your data and test it empirically in the lab. And if you can't do that, then it's nothing, your assertions are nothing but a bunch of hot air, idle opinion, and personal feeling." Wow. Well, that's scientism. You talk to somebody and you're talking about God's existence or Christ, or that abortion's wrong, and they'll say, "Well, prove it scientifically." If you can't prove it scientifically, then nobody can know it. So the issue today is not just whether some religious or ethical claim is true. The more important issue is whether or not it can be known to be true. And I believe that faith is actually having trust or confidence based upon what we know or have reason to believe. And so, as you gentlemen so well put it at the beginning of the show, faith is not a blind step to just choosing to believe something like scientism implies. No. Faith is a trust or confidence based upon what we know,
Yes.
or we have good reason to believe, and that's what your show's all about. But scientism undercuts that and has done so in American culture, so that now in the drinking water, the vast majority of lay people really think that, boy, the scientists are what tell us about reality, and religious people tell us about just this personal idea of faith in their minds.
Yeah, you touched on something there. I'm just going to go on a mini rant for a second, because a lot of Christians say things like, well, I know there's no good reason to, but I'm going to believe this, or, I don't need the evidence, I just believe. But that's not the biblical definition of faith. The biblical definition of faith is having confidence in something. And you don't gain confidence or having confidence in what you don't see. You don't gain confidence in something that you can't see by just hoping for it for no reason. You gain confidence because there's evidence behind it.
Absolutely.
But that's a little mini rant there. But now, so if we're going to reject scientism, though, if we're going to say, okay, truth comes and you can find truth in other areas other than the hard sciences, physics, whatnot.
And
doesn't that mean that we're now going to be relying more on feelings? I'm sure people would be wondering that.
yes. The answer to that is no, and there are a couple of reasons. Number one, there are two kinds of scientism, strong and weak.
Okay.
Strong scientism says the only way to know reality is through the methods of the hard sciences, and everything else is personal feeling and hot air and idle opinion. That's what that physicist told me at that gathering.
Yeah.
But after he spoke for about 2 or 3 minutes, I stopped him and said, "Sir, if you don't mind, I'm having a problem. Maybe you could help me. You're claiming that if you can't test it and prove it in the lab in physics and chemistry, it's nothing but a bunch of hot air and idle opinion and blind faith." He said, "Absolutely." Well, I said, "You've made 30 or 40 assertions in the last 2 or 3 minutes, and I can't think of a single one of them that could be quantified and tested in the lab of chemistry and physics. If I'm wrong about that, would you mind pointing out which one it was? But if I'm right, you see my dilemma."
Yeah.
What that means is that what you've been doing in the last 2 or 3 minutes is spewing nothing but hot air and idle opinion. The point I was making is that strong scientism cannot possibly be true, just like the statement there are square circles in Montana cannot possibly be true,
Right.
because it's logically self-refuting. It's like the sentence, "No sentence of English is longer than 3 words." That sentence falsifies itself. And the statement, "You can only know things through the hard sciences," cannot itself be known through the hard sciences, because it's not a statement of the hard sciences. It is a philosophical statement about the hard sciences. So strong scientism is in deep trouble. Now, there's another version called weak scientism. That says that, okay, we'll grant that there might be some minimal reasons to believe things in philosophy and in maybe theology and ethical claims and so on. But the hard sciences are so vastly superior that if there's ever a conflict between a statement from the hard sciences and one from one of these other fields, the hard sciences win all the time. And furthermore, when the hard sciences move into a new area, like when neuroscience moves into psychology, we start really gaining information for the first time. The problem with weak scientism is twofold. Number one, weak scientism is no stronger than the assumptions on which it rests, and defending and clarifying and stating those assumptions is actually a task of philosophy. What that means is that philosophy is actually better known than science, because science can't be any stronger than our knowledge of the assumptions on which it rests.
Okay, yeah.
Since weak scientism says that science gives a stronger knowledge than philosophy and other fields, it actually undercuts science because science needs philosophical support for its assumptions. Example,
Yeah, what would be one of
science
those?
assumes a correspondence theory of truth, that truth is what corresponds with reality. Science assumes that our cognitive faculties have been designed in such a way that it can know the external world, but not just the external world, it can know its deep structure. And by its deep structure, I mean the invisible entities and laws that stand under the observable phenomena and explain them. We assume that our minds are capable of going beyond the sensory experiences. We assume that mathematics and logic apply to reality. And I could go on and on. Now, every single one of these is currently being debated and rejected by a large number of professors at the university, every one of them. That means that you can't just assert these any longer. You have to state them and defend them.
So
Philosophers do. And weak scientism it depends on the adequacy of a philosophical defense of its assumptions if we're going to take the claims of science to be approximately true.
So an example, you said some of those laws that are not observable that underline the things that we do believe. An example of those would be like gravity or the weak nuclear force. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, or just bonding forces between electrons and neutrons, for example. Laws that govern chemical change are not sense impressionable. They lie beyond what you see in the beaker and explain it.
Right, because someone didn't, put two atoms on a table and wow, they were attracted to each other, and I measured how long it took.
That's right.
It's a little deeper than that.
Right.
You're having to make some not necessarily assumptions, but you're going to have to make some calculations that aren't based on visible stimuli or the five senses.
Yes, and in my book Scientism and Secularism, I show not only how dangerous this ideology is in undermining the things that people care most about, but I also show why weak and strong scientism are just plain silly. And I've already showed that strong scientism is self-refuting, and I've already shown that weak scientism is wrong for the first reason, namely, it cannot justify its own assumptions. And my book contains a very detailed and I think easy to read statement of a whole host of these, and I clarify why science can't justify them. But the other thing that weak scientism gets wrong, as does strong scientism, is that there are things that we know outside of science with greater certainty than the things we know inside science.
Okay, like
For
what?
example, logic and mathematics. Logic and mathematics are what are called a priori disciplines. Science is a collection of a posteriori disciplines. Now, what in the heck does that mean? Well, in the book, I make this very clear. Logic and mathematics are not known through sense impressions. They are known by a grasp of the mind. And logic and mathematics are known through intellectual reason and intellectual intuition, and they amount to necessary truths. Truths that even God could not make false. God himself could not make modus ponens false, which is if P then Q and P, therefore Q.
Yeah, or modus
that
tollens.
ranges throughout all possible worlds. 2 and 2 is 4 is a necessary truth. But the truths of science are contingent truths, and we do not know them. By the way, and they're known through sense impressions, and they're not known with as great a certainty as the laws of logic and mathematics on which science depends. So we know science and logic
Right.
in a non-scientific way. So people try to claim that science that logic and mathematics are scientific. No. There's assumptions of science. Science uses them, but they can't be known through science. Another thing would be that I know my own states of consciousness better than a neuroscientist does.
Right.
In fact, if a neuroscientist is reading my brain activity on an EEG equipment, he has to ask the patient what is going on right now while he's reading the brain meter. When they saw rapid eye movement, we now know that that's indicative of dreaming. But the only way we knew that is when they saw the rapid eye movement, they had to wake the person up and say, what's going on now? Now, why did they have to do that? Because they don't have access to the person's mind or consciousness, because those are non-physical. They only had access to the brain. And so other people's knowledge of what's going on inside of me is based on inference from my body movements and the sounds that come out of my mouth. Mine isn't. I have absolutely direct awareness of consciousness.
Okay, now some people...
I could go on and on.
Yeah, some people might say, okay, well, wait a minute. We now know that rapid eye movement indicates dreaming. Isn't that a hard science, right? We did the research, we proved the theory true. That's hard science.
But we didn't know it was dreaming through the methods of hard science. The methods of hard science could only measure the brain activity or observe the eye movement. That's all. The only way that they could know what was going on mentally is they had to ask the person. And why did they have to do that? Because there is first-person authority over one's consciousness.
Right.
I know what's happening in my consciousness better than anybody else. So that part was not scientific. It was relying upon the epistemically prior knowledge of one's own mental states that they then report to another person.
Right.
We have certain ethical claims that we know with greater certainty than scientific ones. Let me give you an example.
Okay.
I was in the hospital for 9 days recovering from colon cancer surgery.
Yeah, I read about that.
I had a lot of nurses come in, and one nurse came in and said, well, tell me, what do you do? And I said, well, I teach philosophy. I did a BS in chemistry, and then I went into theology, and then I eventually got an MA and doctorate in philosophy. And she looked at me very puzzled. And she said, well, that's a very interesting thing. And I said, well, let me tell you what I think you're thinking right now. What you're thinking is that I started off in chemistry, which was a field that deals with real facts, and you can really know it. That's scientism.
Yeah.
And I moved to theology and philosophy, which is kind of just shuffling opinions, and nobody knows anything for sure. It's just faith. She said, my gosh, that's exactly what I was thinking. And I said, well, do you know that I know torturing little babies for the fun of it with greater certainty than I know that electrons exist? She said, no, that's not possible. And I said, have you ever studied the history of the electron? No. Well, if you study the history of the electron, from J.J. Thomson's version of the electron to German chemists' versions of the electron at the time he discovered the British version, to Bohr's concept of the electron, to the quantum concept of the electron, what we discover is that the idea of what an electron has changed rapidly over the centuries.
Oh, man.
What that means is that if you ask me if electrons exist, I think they do, but there's a real possibility that in 50 years we will revise again and we'll think that the electrons we now believe in don't exist.
Right. Wow.
But I can't think of anything that we could discover in 50 years that would make it rational to start torturing babies for the fun of it.
Exactly. That is so good. So, I mean, listeners, just think about this for a minute, okay? We actually can know with better certainty that torturing babies is evil. And we can know that with more certainty than we can know whether or not the electrons as we know it exist.
Right.
Exactly.
That is
And by the
fascinating.
way, in my book, I make clear that a lot of times, sometimes you can know something without knowing how you know it. So I know a person could know that torturing a little baby for the fun of it is wrong without knowing how they know it. They say, I just do. And that's legitimate, because if you always have to know how you know something, that leads to a vicious infinite regress. So in my book, I address all the things we can know that are independent of science and with great certainty. And then there is one other topic I'd like to mention, if you don't mind, that I think is helpful if we have time.
Yeah, go for it.
I don't believe in the general theory of evolution. I think that intelligent design is more reasonable than the general theory of evolution. But what I'm doing is I'm going against the overwhelming majority of experts in these fields. Now, I don't do that in most other areas. If the majority of cancer doctors say you ought to do this treatment and only 2% say get that one, I'm going with a majority.
Yeah.
And the same with investors and real estate agents and so on. So you almost always go with the majority, but yet I don't do that when it comes to evolution. Now, am I being reasonable? Yes, and here's why. In the book, I give criteria for when it's rational to go against the majority. And number one, you can explain the majority opinion not based on the rational evidence for the opinion, but on the basis of sociological and theological reasons. And when it comes to evolution, the best book on this was Neil Gillespie's book, Charles Darwin and the Problem of Creation. He's not a Christian. It was published with the University of Chicago Press.
Okay.
He said the primary reason evolution won was not the evidence. In fact, the evidence was on the creationist side. He said the reason that evolution won, it was because it was anti-theological. It got theology out of science. And they didn't want theologians to be integrating with science. They wanted science to be a purely methodological naturalist enterprise.
Right.
We also know from sociological studies that young science majors are sociologized into the fields of science in such a way that there is institutionalized punishments and shaming and rejection if you go against the majority paradigm.
Yeah.
So if I had a student doing a doctorate at UCLA. He had a testable dissertation project between intelligent design and naturalistic evolution.
Really?
And his supervisor said, I will not tolerate a dissertation proposal like this. And he said, you will lose your doctoral stipend if you try this. Do not do it. Well, that means that we have a reason why all the experts believe in evolution. Namely, they wanted to get rid of theology, and they've been socialized to not break with the pack.
Yeah.
The second reason it's reasonable to go against the majority is if there is a small, robust group of highly trained intellectuals. Charles Darwin called Thomas Kuhn called them a rebel group that stood outside the main paradigm. So you have a group of highly qualified intellectuals with earned doctorates. They've published in the standard journals and book Oxford Press and so on, who have provided a strong paradigm that runs against the major paradigm. And when it comes to evolution, the intelligent design movement is filled with all you have to do is look at their credentials, and you might disagree with them, but you certainly can't fight against their credentials. So in my book, Scientism and Secularism, I show that for these and a couple of other reasons, it's absolutely rational to go against the majority in the case of evolution when it might not be with oncology and a certain cancer treatment.
Wow, that's great. All right, we're going to do a Bible contradiction, then come right back to this information.
Bible contradiction. All right, today's Bible contradiction: is God warlike or is he peaceful? It's a bona fide contradiction here. Exodus 15:3 says, "The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name." However, Romans 15:33 says, The God of peace be with you all. Amen.
Yeah, so which one is he? Is he a God of war or is he a God of peace?
Right.
Places like infidels.org, the Freedom from Religion Foundation,
Right.
they love to throw these out there. We collect these from those sites and answer them because these are actual accusations. But this is actually one of the more simple contradictions they've brought us. And we use a cracked acronym. The A stands for author's intention. Right. All you have to do is what is the author intending on communicating here? And in Romans 15, he says, "I urge you, brothers and sisters, by our Lord Jesus Christ and by the love of the Spirit," right? He's talking about, hey, this is how I want you to be. I want you to experience the love of God. I want you to live according to the love of God. But in Exodus 15, they're talking there about how God saved Israel from an enemy who is putting them into slavery. And I think most modern people would say, yeah, being put into slavery is a pretty bad deal. God should rescue people from that. So is God a warrior? Yes, when it's appropriate. Mm-hmm. Is God peace-like? Yes, when it's inappropriate. God is both. It's not a contradiction.
Amen.
Hey, Dr. Moreland, is there anything else you might want to add to that?
Not a single thing. That was one great answer.
Right on.
All right, thanks. I mean, sometimes it frustrates me because they put out these as though they're contradictions, and it really doesn't take too long of thinking to understand how it's not a problem. So, all right, thanks.
Right, that's exactly.
Yeah, so that's the answer for our contradiction today.
Bible contradiction.
All right, Dr. Moreland, we're back. We have a few more minutes. I want to ask a little bit about math because a lot of people would say, no, you're wrong there. Math is definitely a hard science. Why don't you explain why it's not?
Well, I go in my book, Scientism and Secularism, I really go into this in some detail as to why math is not a hard science. But a hard science is an approach to a subject matter that, number one, involves sense experience in testing whether your theory is true or false. So the sense experience plays a cognitive role. Secondly, it discovers truths that are contingent truths. That means they may be true, but they don't have to be. It's very easy to conceive of a world where there might have been a different law of gravity or different laws of chemical change. So they discover contingent truths, and their methods are theory postulation and testing the theory against data that they gather from the empirical world.
Yeah.
Now, mathematicians don't do anything. They sit in their chairs. They don't go out looking at birds and studying them or cutting frogs open to see what's going on inside. They just sit around. And their methods are a priori. That means that while a little child may not be able to have the concept of the number 2 or addition until they've seen scribblings on a sheet of paper, when you make a proof in mathematics, you don't appeal to sense experience to draw your conclusion.
Right.
If you do a proof, you are able to simply rationally grasp that the conclusion follows from the premises.
Yeah.
That's called rational intuition, and it's not based on sense experience. So it is purely, math and logic are purely approached through the powers of the mind without using senses to justify mathematical laws and logical laws.
Wow.
Secondly, when mathematicians and logicians do their job correctly, they end up with necessary truths. These are truths that could not possibly be false.
Yes.
And you can't have a sense experience of necessity. If I knew every empirical fact about the world, universe, say I had a God's eye view of the universe and I knew every single empirical fact about the universe, what would follow is I would know what is the case, but I would not know what had to be the case.
Okay, I'm gonna have to.
What could not be the case.
I'm going to have to jump in and cut you off there. We only got about 10 seconds left, but If anyone wants this book, Scientism and Secularism, it comes out September 30th. They can get it on Amazon,
Right, we'll link to it.
all sorts of other places. Hey, thanks for being a guest today. This was amazing.
Great. It's been great.
All right, this is Dr. J.P. Moreland, Scientism and Secularism. If we have more time, we go into other things we can prove without science.